was going to a meeting of World Federalists that I met a Rotarian who introduced me to the Rotary Club.
And say hello to your fellow Rotarian and tell him what you do, because Chan does wonderful things in the Rotary Clubs of India.
And hi, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon. Yes, I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Chicago.
Oh, nice to talk to you. And Charles, I'm from Rotary Club Vishakhapatnam in India, and we are into various projects what we conduct in India. But as of now, I'm there with the Rotarian Action Group for Peace,
yes,
which is into educating people on the nuclear disarmament.
Yes, that's something that I'm beginning to be more involved with. Yes.
He travels around. He travels around India giving talks to Rotary clubs. Isn't that right, Chan?
So we are going to have a weekly meeting on Zoom from next week. I'm organizing that. Otherwise, here, because of coronavirus, entire country is on lockdown.
I think everybody, so far as I know, everybody with good sense is doing that. I haven't been out of my house in 3 weeks. And tell me how things are in Chicago and in Vukovar. Are you folks self-isolating as well?
Oh yes, we've been in quarantine for, I guess it's 2 weeks now, and it's continuing.
Yeah, here you cannot. Here all restaurants are closed, and you cannot travel between cities here. Stores are closed. Only stores that are open are pharmacies and groceries from about 10 to 5, and that's about it. Restaurants are closed, so it's pretty awful.
Where are you from?
Originally, I'm from New York, but I've lived here for 25 years, and I lived in Oregon.
Vukovar is in Croatia, eastern Croatia.
Croatia.
Oh, you're in eastern Croatia? Oh, okay.
Yep.
Oh, here's Paul Maillet.
Where are you from, Paul?
I'm just calling from Ottawa, and below my friend Metta. We work together on various projects, and one of note is the building a peace center in Sri Lanka.
One from Chicago and one from India.
India, oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we're a very diverse group, and at the moment we're comparing notes on how we're coping with our self-isolation. I hope you're staying indoors, are you?
Yeah, we have all the lockdown things going on, I think, that are going on in most places. And probably going to be looking at trying to continue work in some way that's going to be reflecting maybe a new world order that's going to happen, or a new normal. I read
society is never going to be the same again, but the really interesting question is, what will we be like? What is going to come of this? What's your guess?
Well, I read a CBC article this morning that said that society should not be the same again. In other words, the implication was a lot of people will try and bring it back to what it used to be. People, some people are very hard hit, and unfortunately, some of it is the capitalist or the very, very wealthy, and they're going to try to do something that's going to get them back to where they were. And this is probably an opportunity to address some of the inequalities that are happening here. But we're adapting in my business. We're looking at a project to do some training in West Africa, and setting up teams there and country directors and whatnot to do peace building in 3 or 4 countries. And we're adapting to the whole Zoom construct to do training and coaching and mentoring and project activity.
Now, who is we? You need to explain.
Well, there is a company in Toronto. His name is Sekou Komara, and he has he's actually the CPI co-chair of the London chapter. So he's from London, and he has set up this company and to do this. And he has engaged us to provide the subject matter expertise and the training and the coaching and the development activity.
I'm a little confused. If you have a company, to me, that means private enterprise. How can?
Well, I think he's more of an NGO.
All right.
But he's very well connected with these 5 countries because that's where he's from.
And what kind of project is this going to be?
It's called peace building, and it's going to be in some cases in a post-conflict sort of context. In other words, we are going to try to look at a hierarchy or a national architecture which has maybe some kind of peace center that trains some kind of peace practitioners, that goes into the communities and creates, and with some community, the peace construct that involve education with regards to peace practices and reconciliation. And then at the higher level, the National Peace Center will advise the government. They'll do risk monitoring on peace issues, international and domestic peace issues that may be of relevance to them.
Hello, Richard Denton. You
Hi,
with your
Richard.
pink face. Is that a pink face from your cruise, or is it the lighting in your office?
Part of it's natural, part of it's was out walking in the sunshine the other day and the reflection off the snow and the ice on our lake. So
I see. Well, I wanted to introduce the fact that you have just returned from a very, very dangerous kind of travel. That is, you took a cruise in the Indian Ocean, right? And you almost couldn't get back to land.
Well, we had 6 ports of call closed to us, and we flew out of Muscat, Oman, which was not on our schedule. But I think the thing to remember, as Paul is mentioning, is that this does change everything. As Naomi Klein would say, that we're all on the same cruise boat, namely called Mother Earth. And unfortunately, it doesn't have any lifeboats other than for Elon Musk.
You know what? I have to interrupt to say I have not expressed this opinion to you before because it would have sounded like scolding you. But to be honest, I think it's a damn good thing that they're saying that cruise ships are too dangerous and that people should not go on cruise ships. Because my understanding is that those damn things exude the most horrible amount of CO2. And that a big liner can produce as much CO2 as many countries in a year or something. I mean, I'm making that up, but the real figures are shocking enough. I can't remember what the truth is, but I've kind of exaggerated. But still, I think I was already of the opinion before it became such a clearly hazardous thing in terms of the coronavirus, that we should simply forbid any more cruise liners and tell people that they could dock their cruise ships in some harbor and use it for casinos, or people could use it for weekend, entertainment or something like that, but that they couldn't go sailing the oceans anymore. So now you can defend yourself against my implicit accusation, Richard.
Okay, happy to do so, Metta. I was just listening to Rick Steves last night on a TV program called was Rick Steves talking about fascism. And his point was that Americans need to get out and to travel more, to see other cultures, to see how other people live, and learn as a result of that, and therefore create more world understanding. So that's my plea for travel. The second thing is you mentioned cruise ships, and again another friend is Gwen Dyer. We had him up to our place years ago. to give a speech. And so I read his syndicated columns. And he points out that the oil industry first denied that there was a problem with climate change. Then they doubted that it was man-made. And then they try to now defer the blame back onto us as individuals and tell us all the good things that we should be doing, buying electric cars, bicycle, reduce our packaging, reduce our plastic, which are all very good things, but in the hopes that we won't go after fossil fuels and or the military. And I think the military, which was a segment of society that was excluded from the Kyoto Protocol years ago, is much worse than other segments of society, such as cruise ships. I think cruise ships have improved over the years. They used to use the lowest bulk fuel at the bottom, but now they've moved up to diesel. I would say that probably the CO2 per person is not that great. Yes, I think it's the old Monty Python thing was if we didn't have patients, we could run hospitals very efficiently. So therefore, yes, if we didn't do cruise ships and increase world understanding, yes, we could decrease the CO2. And I think when you look at this pandemic, the Asian contagion, which is now the boomer remover, it is unfortunate that it's the boomers that are the voters. And so this could spell some problems for the Democrats in November to the south of us.
Would you say the average person there was a Republican or a Democrat, if we could condense the rest of the world into right and left?
Democrat.
Were they?
Because they're the more liberal people. They're the ones who are traveling and trying to learn about the rest of the world.
Huh.
Discussion over dinner with Americans was always about Canadian health care. I mean,
I want to interrupt you because I want to say hello to a newcomer. Here's Mira. Mira, I'm Metta, and where are you?
I'm in Ottawa.
You're in Ottawa. Very good to meet you. I'd like to get back to Chand and find out what is happening, if you don't mind, in India, because so far, as I understand it, India has not really had the level of contagion that some of the other countries have. Is that the case, Chand? And what is the current situation in India with respect to the pandemic?
In India now, 1 week back, we were about 200 infected people were identified. But during this week, the past week, that is from the Monday to today, it had gone up by about 800 plus earlier 200. Now it's about 1,000 infected people, which we are finding it a bit alarming because in a 1 week, there are fourfold increase from the previous. It had come to 200 to 1,000, but the deaths are confined to 20 deaths out of 1,000 were there. And basically we find in two states which are very high. One is Maharashtra, which is Bombay is the city where Maharashtra in the western part of India, with almost 250 cases. 1/4 of the Indian cases are coming from Maharashtra. And another state down south, Kerala, where if you have heard a city by name Cochin, which is very famous in that state again has close to 230 cases. These two put together are 50% of the total cases in India.
Mhm.
And when it comes to my state, Andhra Pradesh, where I reside, we have total infected cases 19, only 19, not a single death. And this state is one of the lowest in, pandemic in
Mhm.
India. We don't
Sure.
know. We don't know whether it's going to shoot up, but then this is the crucial week which we are going to head from tomorrow. Why? Because we are at the fag end of stage 2. If we are entering into stage 3, we are going to have that fear very much. So and the country is just feeling to watch in this week by taking all the necessary precautions by quarantining, self-quarantining under our homes, not going out
Mhm.
and locking down ourselves and trying to do all our best. I think we are going to win over coronavirus.
Mira, come back and tell me a little bit about you. So what is it that you do? What's your cause?
Well, I'm working with Paul Maillet.
Tell me about the Sri Lanka project.
Well, now we are all waiting, but
It's something that hasn't started, is that right?
it has started, but not really field work, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So,
Mira sits on a Canadian advisory committee. That we have 5 countries involved in this project, and we have a council, and of which Mira is part of.
Is it the same kind of project that you want to do in Africa?
Yeah, yes, I'm co-chair of the Canadian group, the Canadian Sri Lankan group, and as you well know, that Sri Lanka has come out of a devastating war with hundreds of thousands of people killed, and they're in a post-conflict situation. And unfortunately, in the last Easter, for example, violence is starting to emerge again between the various religious sects. And what the country and the people representing the project there want to do is to create a national peace center.
Okay, let's go back to Evan, because Evan is in Chicago, and I think tell us what kind of projects you were engaged with, and I'd like for us to give some thought, if we can, to ways in which we may be able to still do something worthwhile, even when we're cooped up at home in self-isolation. And I don't know whether anybody has any projects that you're able to work on from home, but I find myself just as busy these days as I would have been, if I were not in self-isolation. So what is it you're up to these days?
Well, I am a member of the Rotary Action Group for Peace, but I'm a spectator in that environment. My main engagement has been with Citizens for Global Solutions to get it re-established. There was a time during the 2010s and the late aughts where there was a primary effort to get humanitarian treaties approved by the U.S. Senate, which was totally fruitless. And there's a whole list of them, starting with the Treaty on the Law of the Sea. In any case, we are reestablishing Citizens for Global Solutions with its historic mission. Actually, the official name of Citizens for Global Solutions is the World Federalist Association. There is a counterpart in Canada. There is an international affiliate associated as well called the World Federalist Movement, which was actually very instrumental in getting the International Criminal Court signed by many countries and ratified. So we have a very illustrious past, which we are actually returning to by advocating for world government.
Oh,
That
that's
was-
great. You know, the other day I did a talk show, one of my weekly talk shows with two of the leading world federalists in Canada. Fergus Watt is the person who runs the Canadian movement. And we had a conversation also with John Daniele. So you might want to have a look at that and share it with your friends in the Citizens for Global, what is it called?
Citizens for, well, we publish a semi-annual magazine jointly with World Federalists of Canada.
Good, excellent. I see that Richard Denton has raised his hand.
On the 23rd, the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, came out saying that we should have a ceasefire and concentrate on working together to combat COVID-19. And so we in Rotary are now coming up with a letter of support to support the UN, to support WHO, to support the global, global alert and response network, GORN, and to strengthen these organizations so that we can be better prepared for the next pandemic. And also, of course, what we want to do is to get rid of the military and get rid of wars. And so using this crisis as an opportunity to speak out on that. Anne Frisch has just joined us, and she's, again, another fellow Rotarian. And she also is with the Rags for Peace, Nuke-Free Planet.
Sorry, Rags for Peace?
Rotarian Action Group.
Oh,
So,
Anne, good to see you again.
Frantic morning, sorry to be late.
Tell us what's going on in your part of the world.
We're working to get Rotary International to speak out on the abolition of nuclear weapons. And we were trying to lend some support to UN Association members of our group who we suggested they do a sign-on to the Secretary General's appeal, organizational sign-on. And I haven't heard back, but I still think it's a good idea. A couple groups have individual sign-ons. I think we need a group sign-on.
Now you're talking about, he made two recent appeals, one having to do with the coronavirus, but just a few days before that, he made an appeal for a global ceasefire of all wars. And is that what you're referring to?
That's the one we're referring to.
What are you doing? I see that you Rotarians certainly have fire in your belly, and you're working hard. Is that is that what the Rotarians are onto these days?
I think Rotary in general is becoming more interested in peace, maintaining peace, making peace, and defining the conditions of peace. And that involves, in some ways, big data analyses of what makes for peaceful conditions. And you know that Rotary has been fully engaged with the polio eradication. That does translate to medical care for coronavirus as well, using the same infrastructure. But it's the polio eradication is almost done. So the question is, what's next?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think also in terms of the polio, the two countries that still have polio are Afghanistan and Pakistan, where there is a conflict. And so again, the emphasis that we need to get rid of the conflict so that we can get in there and do the vaccination. And this has been the problem last year one of our volunteers was shot and killed in doing the polio. So just add that to Evan's comments.
Well, tell me, you know, a few years ago, there was a big flap because I think the CIA or somebody pretended to be healthcare workers going around vaccinating people when they were actually doing surveillance or spying. At least that was the allegation, that they wrongfully used the cover of vaccination campaign or something of that kind, and that this has tainted the name of healthcare. It has, in some places, made the population suspicious of anybody who comes around saying they want to offer vaccination or any other kind of healthcare. I'm making this up. I know there's some truth behind it, but my account of what really went on is just very hazy. Does anybody remember exactly what happened? And is that something that is actually relevant, whatever, when you try to talk about linking healthcare campaigns to ceasefire campaigns?
I think it is relevant, Metta. I've heard that story, and that was, quote, how they found bin Laden and assassinated him. And so most recently, of course, Iran is facing enormous pressures with the coronavirus, having a lot of deaths there as a result. And they called out on America, expressing their distrust for the United States. And I think that results from what you've just said. And right now, of course, the International Atomic Energy Agency that's been monitoring Iran and monitoring its centrifuges and trying to make sure that they don't produce a nuclear weapon are probably not active because of the virus. And so therefore, again, we need to lift the sanctions on Iran to allow healthcare to get into Iran and help them out, so that the IAEA can go in and do their job.
My impression was, and I want to be corrected if I'm wrong, that most countries see it as their own problem, and very few countries are actually coming to the aid of other countries, although I understand lately, in the last few days, China is sending things that maybe they have surplus now. They're sending things to Italy, I believe. So to what extent is there international support? There should be. You know, somebody was just saying we ought to try to create an ad hoc world government so we could actually address this pandemic in a holistic way. But to what extent is there international support for this medical treatment?
Well, I think, again, Cuba is another country that's sending their doctors overseas to a variety of countries, and even to countries that have been very antagonistic to Cuba, such as Bolsonaro in Brazil. But also they're sending their doctors to Italy, to Poland. And I think, again, this points out the need for the world federalists, a strong world government, strengthen UN to restructure it. Probably we need to get rid of the Security Council and their veto ability, because when they talk about consensus, to them that means veto.
Yes, I see you have your finger up, and I want to call on Charles Tauber. Okay.
There are 2 points that I would like to make. First of all, nobody, as far as I can see, is speaking about the mental health aspect and the mental health consequences of what's happening with COVID. and with, yeah, because a lot of people are suffering not only from the COVID itself, but from all the measures that are being taken to suppress it, all of the isolation and all the rest of that. Nobody is speaking about that, and I think it's an extremely important issue. The second point that I'd like to make quickly, and we can come back to both of these if you'd like, a lot of issues are being ignored because of COVID. And for example, we're working with a group that's assisting child soldiers in Congo. They're being completely ignored.
Who's been ignored?
Well, anybody with post-conflict situations or conflict situations in terms of the mental health aspects of it. Example, reintegration of former child soldiers into society in places like Congo, South Sudan, those sorts of places. The whole migrant situation here in Southern Europe, Italy, which has a huge COVID load, but also has a huge migrant load. So all of this is being ignored because of the quote unquote practical aspects of COVID. Now, what that's going to mean is that people are going to be dysfunctional and for a very long time. And these are not issues that will go away in 10 minutes once COVID is solved or once it goes back. These are issues that are going to be on top of the traumas that people already have. I can think of Bangladesh as another example of that, with the Rohingya. And we can name probably 100 places in the world that are like that. So I'm very, very concerned about the whole mental health side of all of these things. And Paul, I would urge you, for example, in those projects in all of those countries to, in terms of peace building, I've been doing this for, well, more than 30 years now. And I would very strongly urge you in the peace, our organization is called the Coalition for Work with Psychotrauma and Peace. And we're very much on the peace building side of things. And I would very much urge people to include the mental health aspect into any peace building efforts.
Yes, we do that. We actually have one component of peace practices, entitled resiliency and facing suffering and trauma as a basic sort of preventative skill that we would want to try to teach all citizens. But
what would be the content of such a program? I'm just trying to imagine what if I were trying to go into a community of people that had been traumatized by having their houses blown up and their family killed. What could I possibly say to them that would make them more resilient psychologically? I just don't know how you could even begin to cope with things as a psychodynamic kind of issue. Maybe it's my failure of imagination. Tell me what you actually tell these people.
Well, you've got two components to this. One is to give people that are reasonably functional, good healthy practices in which they can use when they encounter suffering or trauma. The other is with regards to traumatized people, and that's going to be the domain of the clinical response. We are not in the business of training every citizen. We will train cadres of peace practitioners, but they will not be at the level of either a clinical response or a criminal response. They handle conflict resolution, they learn nonviolent communication, they learn how to get along with each other, and they learn some basic skills about resiliency. And in the particular countries that we're dealing with, particularly Sri Lanka, meditation is a strong cultural tradition. So there are things that you can leverage in these countries to make a difference. But basically, give people the necessary skills and practices that they can use, and at the point of clinical or judicial responses, there is that domain.
Well, is there any
I'd like to come.
something like if you're dealing with a real life situation, I
Yeah.
wonder, telling people to meditate or to practice deep breathing or yoga.
You're right.
I'm sorry, I'm a little, I don't know. I
Um,
don't know how far that
I'd
would
like
go.
to.
You're
Go ahead.
We have a program which we called Pragmatic Empowerment Training, PET, was on our website and which was the subject of one of Metta's programs not so long ago. That uses the experience of people in their own cultures to teach them how to work with, first of all, the most important skill that we see is listening and actually getting the trauma out, not letting it fester, and then coming to some sort of positive resolution. I've been doing that since 1988 with people. And this is based on Carl Rogers' participatory education methodology. And it works. We've seen it here in the Balkans. We've seen it work here in the Balkans quite well. People get the skills of listening and working with one another at local level. And those become also self-help groups. And those are very important skills, and it binds the community together as well. Because these groups form and they actually people talk to one another within their own communities. Now, we serve the way that our role, or the role of a national person, is first of all to facilitate the first groups within that community, and second of all to provide supervision and additional education where they don't have it. And people respond very, very well to this. We've done quite a number of groups.
I totally agree.
Okay, what comes up? If you have a session, typically what will come up? Is it going to be, when they are talking about their trauma, are they going to mention something that happened during the war when they saw somebody kill somebody else, or they were conflicted about whether they should pull the trigger or run or what to do? What kinds, I'm just trying to get at a notion of what people are really still trying to grapple with years after the trauma itself. What is still bugging them that you can actually help them cope with?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. In this context, there's an event that happened that's become a memory that now has an emotion attached to it, which is inserting itself into the present. So there has to be some conversation about that. In our communities of peace construct, Charles, I totally agree with you. One of the linchpins of the program is socialization. You know, that people can get together and talk about these kinds of things, and in whatever easy, informal construct that you can have, mainly around their events, their cultural events, their religious events, whatever they are doing, and to tease these things in certain ways. But once people are traumatized, I think the medical response is really important. And I have met people who have, you know, gone through the Khmer Rouge and the Pol Pot regime and things like that, and they are still having these kinds of problems. And it's not to try to solve it for them, but get them help.
What we say is, first of all, we don't pathologize it.
No, us neither.
We say that it's a normal reaction to what's going on. Now, when people hold things inside, they fester and they become bigger. So the biggest thing is to figure out ways within their culture of getting out what has happened. And when a traumatic event happens, they push the trauma inside. Okay? Now, they have to get that out in some way, one way or another. And the best way is to have a safe place where they can express that among people who are empathetic with them and who are similar to them, so that they can share their feelings with other people. That's what we have found to be the most effective way. And they can cry and they can scream and they can express thoughts that would not be popular otherwise.
Okay, now
And
let me, another side question. Would these groups, could it include people who were their enemies before? Or are
Croatia.
these, the groups that are supportive, that can listen to each other, are they always the people who were on the same side in the conflict?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, but at first, sometimes that's necessary. It's very, very strongly dependent on the local situation. What we've found here, for example, is that the politicians strongly encourage the ethnic division. And that's a real problem.
Well,
They do not
the
encourage.
trick is how to manage it. And I think, you know, there are various techniques for doing that. One is to try to soften the language on both sides independently in a peace-oriented language. And I don't know if you've heard of the Zulu method of conflict
No.
resolution. It's a
No.
2-week kind of thing or something like that. And the conflicting parties get together socially. And they go on, I don't know, canoe trips or have sporting events. They bring their families and they get to know each other as people rather than objects. And that goes on for about 10 or 11 days. And then they solve the problem in 2 days because they're no longer looking at each other as enemies or somebody to be overcome. And this has some application in some situations, probably not all, but is one way of doing it. And I think, David, the theme that we have is the issue of socialization that's supportive, that people who care for you are around you and can make you feel safe. And that is absolutely critical.
I agree with that. What we have found is that simply talking, getting it out, having that safe place where they can talk about that, that's the critical issue. The other point is something that people like Vomik Volkan talk about, and that's the whole transmission of trauma. So that this can go for generations and generations and generations. And in fact, I have a couple of clients at the moment who are dealing with at least 3 or 4 generations of that kind of trauma. And unless you deal with that as well, this historical stuff, for example, around here, World War II, still in 2020, is a huge issue.
Do you use the theory of mimetic structures? We have this application here at one of the universities. One of the authors wrote something, Vern Redikoff, and his idea is that one has to first be aware of the mimetic structure that's in play. A mimetic structure is something you mimic your environment and you adopt its values and beliefs in order to survive or belong. So that, for example, we had a residential schools issue. And some of the people who suffered under this thing can still not find it in themselves to forgive. So the question is that if we have this mimetic structure, and these mimetic structures pass on what they call structures of blessing or structures of violence from generation to generation to generation. And the first way to deal with that is of course being aware that this structure is in play. So the idea to the residential victims might be something like, we realize that you can't forgive and these issues are ongoing and we're going to try and deal with them, but try not to pass it on to your children. You know, be aware of passing on either victimization to your children or any sort of cultures of being the oppressor, to take it from that point of view. And this of course is a subject of endless talk, you know, just to be sympathetic and being aware of whatever structures they are. And in some of these communities of peace applications, one of the things is, let's have a conversation about what are the values and beliefs that we're passing on to our children, and are they positive and are they negative, and should we change them in some little way, just some small ways. You don't want your kids to smoke outside, kind of thing.
And
When I was working on the first manual for the Unarmed Civilian Protection by Nonviolent Peace Force, I was working with Rolf Carrier in Geneva, and he got the training division of the United Nations to put up a training on simple trauma techniques. And he says the most researched one is, and I forget the name of it, but some of you will recognize it. It's getting, so even a peacekeeper in the field could do this. You recognize that a person dealing with trauma, you get them to explain it, and to relive it, and at the same time to focus their eyes on a wall and not move it until they're done with their story, which is difficult enough to do. But I've done that in some simple situation. I found it's very helpful. But in terms of the research literature, I have no clue. But the practicalities of Nonviolent Peace Force, for whom I work, works in a war zone. You're dealing with multiple traumas, generations, of course, but just in their own lifetimes of losing parents and seeing people get murdered, that they are multiply traumatized, and you don't have time for the talking part of it, except very brief as you encounter it and get through it. And if this works, I think we should go for it big time. But again, I'm not an expert.
I don't agree. What we are saying is that we train what we call peer supporters or barefoot therapists. And these are people without previous education who are within the community. And they function, our experience is that they function very, very well. Why? Because there's no stigmatization. They can have talks with people as friends, and they understand the local culture. They understand the local situation. They understand the transmission. They understand all of the stuff that we as outsiders and that the so-called professionals very frequently do not understand and cannot relate to the people on the ground in a similar way. And this works very well in our experience.
what is the controversy here? I'm not sure what you disagree with, Charles, that Anne said. In fact, I'm not sure I understand what all the implications of what Anne was saying. Something about focusing on the wall when you talk about your trauma. I never heard of that before, but is there really a dispute here, or what am I perceiving as a dispute?
Well, what I see as the dispute is there's a bit of a difference between the clinical community and the non-clinical community doing things. Yeah. And at what level does one say, I'm over my head and I should be passing it on, or there are some things I can do and I can do them. In other words, we don't go running to ethicists all the time when we have a moral dilemma. I mean, everyone has some sort of idea of how to make an ethical decision. But there are some that you may have to defer to, medical panels or things like this. So I think that's the basic thing.
I completely agree with you, Paul. I think that there are things that you do need to refer, but the majority of things
you can do.
And that's you can do.
Yeah.
And you learn, you get people within these communities who are more expert than the experts.
Yes,
and that's our experience with it.
Yeah, and can be more effective. An example is in our First Nations, people may be a little reticent to go to an outside doctor that's been flown in because you've got problems. Because when you're sitting with the doctor, what's in the air between you is I am sick and you are not, and you're going to bring healthy things and I'm bringing suffering. Whereas if they do it their way, they sit around a sacred fire where nothing is broken. Everybody has a life that has difficulties and suffering and these kinds of things, and there's a normalization of that. And you can talk about these sorts of issues and get them resolved in that kind of conversation, you know, without the implication that you are sick. And
This is precisely our approach. This is
Okay.
precisely our approach.
And is that really what Anne is disputing? Anne, are you taking
no,
exception
not.
to that
No, no,
point
no,
of view?
My main concern right now is, can we mitigate the trauma that's going on? We have some reports of abuse in families, abuse to partners and children, and we are now seemingly hopeless to deal with this because the people who are considered the perpetrators are tracking movements on cell phones and the same old things they always do. I don't know how to deal with this myself. It's way outside my area of expertise. But we also, people are all very isolated. I am blessed to be home with my partner doing the things I always do, going shopping and going for walks, and it's about, my life is just about it. But I'm feeling cabin fever, and I resolve it with my Zoom meetings. Charles, I think that supports your point there, and maybe yours also, Paul.
I'm interested in this question of whether or not a trauma has to be treated as a medical problem by professionals. And, you know, this is term PTSD, which I think is definitely considered a medical condition where there actually may have been injury to the brain or the nervous system or to the physiological functioning of the person through the trauma. And I guess they give medication. And definitely it sounds to me like it's something that's treated as a medical problem, and that talking is not considered sufficient to as a treatment procedure. Is that, you know, if I can ask Charles and Paul again, because I think you guys are in agreement that you're talking about a kind of therapy that involves, well, I love the word barefoot therapists, because it means ordinary people can help each other. But presumably, if you're talking about PTSD, that's something that the barefoot therapist couldn't cope with.
Well, I would agree with you. PTSD is one of those thresholds that all of a sudden put it in the medical domain. I mean, you're not talking about an individual now in which you can have a good conversation. These people are suicidal, they're dysfunctional, they go into alcohol, they can't hold a job, they can't function in life. I mean, I think we tend to overuse the word PTSD, and you know, whereas a lot of these issues may well be traumatic, but the question is, are they being traumatized when they suffer these things?
I've found very, very few people in all of the time that I've been working who are, how shall I say it, who absolutely need medication or actually need to have, quote unquote, a clinical approach.
I want to, you know, we've been talking about mental conditions as the effect of various kinds of traumas and of conflict, wars, supposedly. But, you know, there's also the problem of psychological conditions as the cause of various kinds of conflicts. In other words, we're so screwed up that we get ourselves into fights, or we don't have good sense about whom to vote for. We elect a Donald Trump, or we, you know, do something crazy because we just plain don't have good sense anymore. But I'm not as worried about the effects of trauma on the survivors, if you will, as I am on the fact that the whole population is so screwed up mentally, and there are so many messed up people that we can't cope, that our population is going to make decisions, even democratically, that are, extremely unwise and mean to me that simply democracy can't work unless you have a population that's in good mental condition. And by mental condition, I mean their values and their ability to think and their ability to plain process information about how things work, or what, how, whether or not you want to stay indoors during an epidemic or go out and socialize. Simple things like, they're not simple, they're complicated issues, but they're practical human problems that are not being addressed well just because people are too screwed up to cope and to make reasonable decisions. So now tell me how to solve that one, please, now that I've thrown that one in your lap.
Well, the way I look at it is the conversation that you're having. I mean, choices are acts of creation. And I think what we're doing is, in this whole thing, is we're talking about what is. And what is cannot be otherwise at any given moment, as the saying goes. And so then we start talking about what will be in terms of doom and gloom, whereas perhaps we should be talking about what should be. And we should be trying to put alternatives and whatnot into the consciousness of people at this moment, so that, when they come to making these choices, at least they have some other things to think about and some other choices to have. Yeah, we're going down a road right now that is not healthy in many ways.
Anybody else want to take a crack at this?
The Chinese word for crisis is not only the crisis part, but it's also opportunity. So what are the opportunities that we have here to shape this society in a way that's going to be really healthy? The economic ones, the peacemaking ones. I mean, in my business as a peacemaker, one of the critical things in peace services is readiness and willingness. You don't get too long, but you have to be able to see the entry points when they emerge, the chances. And this could be a huge entry point. I mean, it's one thing for the United Nations to call for a ceasefire. It's another thing to look around at the various conflicts that are going on, and perhaps the ability of the belligerents to manage conflict is decreasing. I mean, they don't have good healthcare plans. And there may well be some weaknesses appearing in a lot of these things that one can take advantage of. The biggest one for me is medical diplomacy. I mean, medical diplomacy. We should get into that in spades, as opposed to the history that we have of military diplomacy in, for example, the Middle East and places like that.
Medical diplomacy, please elaborate.
You have a focus on, if you look at the laws of armed conflict, they start with just cause and in fact invoke the death penalty. They rattle their way down through what weapons you use or whatever, and at the very bottom they talk about protecting civilians and non-combatants and that kind of thing. Well, if you flip it on its heel, and you look at something as a precursor to military diplomacy, the first thing you do is you stop the violence, you care for the victims, you do the negotiation or whatever, and it's only at the bottom you get to the justice part of it, rather than starting with the justice part of it. And the way that your entree into the whole field is going to be healthcare, the care for the victims part, but it's not only the care for them in the conflict sense, but also this virus that we've got going on here. And even belligerents are going to be needing those sorts of things.
My goodness, that is thinking big. That's a very ambitious notion, that to take the coronavirus epidemic as an opportunity to reach people who need medical help and to get them to stop fighting long enough to
get it.
I kind of think there may be something to the notion that we're all so busy and so preoccupied with the medical problem. I think there may sort of be various kinds of de facto ceasefires just because people are so preoccupied with other matters that they're not very interested or competent to fight. But that's just a guess.
Well, there was a huge
one that
with
would
all
have
respect,
implications for long-term survival. That, in other words, after the epidemic is over, it wouldn't leave us in any better condition really establish a lasting peace.
But there was a huge example of this week. The NATO exercises that were scheduled with regards to the Russian Empire, these NATO readiness things, were all canceled by the Germans because the Germans would not allow a lot of the troop movements and the supply movements and whatnot to go through their country. So that, you know, in a sense, it's not about calling for a ceasefire, and it's a sense that some lessening of tension is happening, you know, happening right now due to the fact that many of these three major exercises will not be prosecuted.
Well, it's a nice breather, but is this going to actually give us any grounds for thinking that, well, when the epidemic is over, we're going to be in a better position for peace? I don't know. I mean, I think the peace process, I think we've got problems that cannot be put on hold while we're taking care of our epidemic. We can't wait to talk about these other things and just hope that maybe the virus will, we can handle the virus, and then we'll go to these other matters and handle them. Sorry, but we have to handle them all.
Well, you're absolutely right. And $1 trillion bailout, where are you going to get the money, you know, eventually to do that? You're going to find that some of these military exercises are unaffordable. And maybe some of this conflict just ceases to become affordable. I think the number one target, you know, if you're going to try to alleviate the debt, has got to be, for example, in the United States, this almost $1 trillion defense budget they have, you know.
I have listened to a podcast recently by Nouriel Roubini, who is a professor of economics at NYU. He's also an Iranian. He is characterizing the present situation as geopolitical depression, and goes on to say that unless we're definitely in a recession, but unless proper measures are taken, there will be a depression. And one of the things he talks about is the erection of boundaries, of exclusionary boundaries for both goods and people, as a protective reflex that will lead to exactly that, a much worse outcome than would otherwise be the case, that with some, you know, proactive measures. Let me throw one other thing out. He has a very interesting speculation, which I'd like to mention in this group, that Iran is being pushed to the desperation by the sanctions, by the medical situation, and the social situation. And one possibility he feels is that Iran may provoke a war. Why? Now, get ready for this. This is a mind bender. To induce a regime change in the United States.
Okay. Richard Denton, you have a comment here about the IPPNW effort. Can you explain what IPPNW is trying to do vis-a-vis Iran?
What we want to do is, again, on a humanitarian basis, is to lift the sanctions against Iran that the U.S. has put in place, so that we can help them with their COVID-19.
What are the odds that you're going to get the U.S. government to even take its eye off the virus situation long enough to think about humanitarian concerns for the Iranian people?
Well, I think you're right, Metta, that the U.S. is not going to do that. Two, I think Trump is not all that concerned with COVID-19 until just recently, and as New York, et cetera, become very hot spots for it, he's now having to react to it. But I think the thing is to get the other countries who to start sending aid to Iran to help them with the pandemic is what is needed. And I think that doing it through the UN and with organizations like Rotary, with IPPNW, with the ICRC, backing that then it actually can happen.
I think our time is up. It's now 4 o'clock. Unless somebody has something you want to say as a last parting word. If you do, here's your chance.
Thank you very much, Metta, for organizing this.
Thank
Much
you
appreciate it. Thank you.
for participating. It's been interesting and valuable, I think. Bless your hearts, and let's all stay healthy and take care of each other.
Okay.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Metta. And
Bye.
we had a very nice, interaction. Thanks a lot for every one of you.
Thank you, Chad.
Good to see you, Chad.
Bye.
Good to see you,
Bye.
Paul.
Yeah,
See you.
take care,
Good to
everybody.
see you.
Be well.
Take care. See you. Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.